Laughing Bird Psalm 1. Lord, how good it will be for those who turn a deaf ear to the advocates of greed, who steer clear of corrupt shortcuts and avoid those who sneer at goodness. Instead, they relish your word, Lord. Calming their minds, they savor the scriptures day and night. You make them strong and healthy, like a red gum tree with its roots deep in a riverbank, flowering abundantly every season, and always laden with healthy leaves. All that they do is vibrant with life. But what a different story it is for the wicked. They are about as secure as dry leaves in a cyclone. They will have no defense when they are brought to justice, and no friends among the people of integrity. Lord, you keep a protective eye on all who walk a straight path of peace and justice, but nothing will save those who leave their road. Scripture reading, James chapter 3, 13 through chapter 4, 8. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, spiritual, devilish. For there is envy and selfish ambition. There will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. You covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy. Or do they suppose that it is for nothing that the scripture says, God yearns jealously for the spirit that he has made to dwell in us? But he gives all the more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourself, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded.
Last year, the Chico Area Interfaith Council received a grant to develop education and prevention programs to address the increasing wave of hateful speech and hateful actions in our community, and let's face it, our world. And the rationale for applying was, who better to address hate than a coalition of faith communities whose task is to teach other people about God's love. And so now we're making plans for how to spread this love. We've been working on some projects already that address issues like bullying in schools. And then later this year, we're going to discuss strategies for creating safer worship spaces so that we can talk about what we have in common and how we can stand up to hateful words and actions. And so starting yesterday and going all the way through next week, through Saturday, we are observing United Against Hate Week. And so the council asked faith communities, faith leaders, to consider focusing on how we can use our words and actions to restore broken relationships that cause the kind of conflicts that give birth to hate. And all of us ministers there who followed the New Common Lectionary said, we can do that because we are going through the book of James. James is all about how words and actions matter. So here we are. Review. Here's a recap. Week number 1 in the book of James was all about words matter. Week number 2 was actions matter as much as our words. And then last week was we need to be mindful of the power of our words and learn how to use those words wisely. This week, James is encouraging his church to use wisdom to figure out why we tear each other down with conflicts and disputes. Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, James asks, those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. So according to James, our desire to want what we don't have is the source of a lot of our troubles. And that shouldn't surprise us, because thou shalt not covet is number 10 on our 10 commandments. So then the question becomes, what does it mean to covet? Well, it means that you spend your time and energy perseverating on what someone else has that you do not. And most of the time when we talk about coveting, we think about material possessions. We compare what we lack to what others have. And so we think, wow, I sure wish I had that fancy red Toyota pickup truck with four-wheel drive there that guy has, or golly, I sure wish I had that house or that stock portfolio, or whatever it is. What we lack, we see in others, and that's what coveting is. We say, James says that the better life is not found in collecting more material goods. The better life is found in works that are done with gentleness born of wisdom. Now there's a phrase right there that doesn't occur anywhere else in the Bible except for the book of James. Gentleness born of wisdom. James says wisdom is the key to building and healing our relationships. So then where does wisdom come from? From above, according to chapter 3, verse 17. This is godly wisdom that we're talking about here, not earthly wisdom. All right, then, how do we know whether something is godly or not? So I hear a lot of preachers who start their sentences out with, God told me, or God revealed to me. But sometimes the next thing that come out of their mouths is awful, right? And I say, God told you what? Because in my understanding of the way things work, Scripture needs to back up what God tells you, right? Otherwise, I'm going to be pretty suspicious about the source of your revelation. Now, to be fair, we've got to acknowledge that the only Scripture that James's church has was what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, which was the standard for Jewish communities in that day. But remember, there were plenty of Gentiles in those churches too. The source of their revelation was usually logic and good moral fortitude. So thankfully, James recognizes this and gave them a tool that those Gentiles could get their heads wrapped around. He gave them a good old-fashioned Greco-Roman vice and virtue list. So let's get into that. The question again is, how do you know when you run across wisdom from above, and how do you distinguish it from wisdom from below? According to James, you can be sure it's godly wisdom if it's gentle in word and action, peaceable, willing to yield, merciful, bears good fruit, impartial, sincere. Good wisdom leads to peace and reconciliation. Earthly wisdom, however, is distinguished by envy, self-ambition, disorder, wickedness, and bad fruits. So in James's day, there were a lot of religious people going around who were claiming that they had spiritual authority, but really what they were was just wolves in sheep's clothing. And they were preaching a message that was totally opposite of what Christ's teachings were. Okay, but how did they get away with this? Because wouldn't it be obvious to people in the church that they weren't preaching the gospel? Wouldn't people say, whoa, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right? Well, think about how many pseudo-Christian cults are out there who have led or are leading God's people astray, and quite often into harm's way. Think about that. I know it seems like we overuse Jim Jones as the poster boy for cult leaders. If you haven't heard of Jim Jones, back in the 1970s, Jim Jones led his church of close to 1,000 people down to Guyana, South America, where he convinced them to drink poison Kool-Aid. Jim Jones started out as a disciples minister. That's us. Okay? And as much as we'd like to sweep him under the rug and pretend he wasn't one of ours, the truth is, he was. He was. What's embarrassing is that we, as disciples, have a reputation for being smart and practical and down to earth and not easily fooled. And yet, Jim Jones managed to fool 918 people to the point that they would end their lives at his command. That's some power. Not from above, though, right? Definitely not from above. Truth be told, there are many other false prophets out there who might not go as far as Jim Jones did, but they're still leading their flocks astray. So again, how do we know which ones are faithful to the gospel of Christ and which ones are in it for themselves? James gave his people a clear path to discovering the difference between wisdom from above and wisdom from below. It's very similar to Paul's fruits of the Spirit that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, versus the deeds of the flesh. That was his vice and virtue list. James teaches that godly wisdom leads to peace and reconciliation. Now think about some of the terms that James uses here. Gentleness in word and deed. Now sometimes gentleness is used interchangeably with weakness. But that is not the case. Because when I think gentle, I think calm. Now let's say you run into someone who is having a mental health crisis and who is acting out in a negative way. If you want to make a bad situation worse, get up in their face and yell at them. Say something like, calm the heck down and quit acting crazy. I'll guarantee you that's not going to go well. But if you want to de-escalate the situation, remain calm. Stay engaged. Because you have a much better chance of succeeding if you approach the situation gently. That's not weak. In fact, if anything, it's an act of strength. Next one. Willing to yield, which in some situations can mean admitting when you're wrong. But that doesn't seem to be in style nowadays, does it? In fact, the rules of engagement these days seem to be, even when someone provides evidence that you are wrong, double down, and never yield. Meow. How about be merciful? The prophet Micah said that the Lord requires us to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Jesus, according to Luke's gospel, told his disciples to be merciful as your God is merciful. In his Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, because they will obtain mercy." And then in Ephesians, the Apostle Paul writes that God is rich in mercy. Mercy is showing grace and forgiveness even when someone has not earned it. But we can't even get our heads wrapped around giving aid or resources to people who don't deserve it. Okay, how about impartial? Impartiality requires a willingness to hear all sides of an argument and to be open to changing our minds. None of these things are easy, nor do they come naturally. And yet, these are characteristics of godly wisdom. There's the virtue list. Let's take a look at the vice list. Earthly wisdom, or wisdom from below, is marked by envy that leads to coveting, which again is prohibited in the Ten Commandments. Then there is self-serving ambition. Jim Jones did not do what he did out of love. He did it because he was able to get people to serve him rather than God. Now that's a true sign of a cult leader right there. A cult leader will always choose selfish desire over serving God or others. Always. James also lists disorder. And you might be thinking, uh-oh, my life is hardly in order. Does that mean that I'm not in favor with God? Okay, but let's think about this. It's one thing to have a messy garage or a messy kitchen, right? But it's an entirely different thing to be constantly sowing seeds of chaos and drama. People who are motivated by wisdom from below cause trouble everywhere that they go. They cause confusion everywhere they go. They can't even function unless they're stirring something up. Then there's wickedness. That's pretty straightforward. If you haven't been keeping up with the news this last week and you want to see a shocking list of wicked behavior, check out the charges against music mogul Sean P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, so many names that he has, Combs. If this guy is convicted of even some of the charges that have been brought against him, he is going to be in prison for a long time. Think of how many cult leaders and false teachers who've been brought down when their wicked behavior comes to light. Then finally, James mentions bad fruits. Now, we've already talked about that when we were talking about Paul's fruits of the Spirit versus deeds of the flesh. In the book of Galatians, that's what Paul had. He had the good fruits and the bad fruits. That his list, when it comes to bad fruits, that is jealousy, strife, anger, quarrels, dissension, factions, drunkenness, fornication, which in the South it's fornication. Just letting you know, if you ever hear it pronounced like that, person's probably in the south of the Mason-Dixon. Idolatry, impurity, all of those things, fruits of deeds of the flesh. These are the byproducts of relying solely on earthly wisdom, which always leads to conflict and divisions. So then, how do we turn from earthly wisdom and embrace godly wisdom? Well, chapter 4, verse 7 and 10 through 10 says that we must submit to and focus on God. We need to be cleansed and purified from that which drags us down and causes us to be fractured and divided, distanced and distracted. We've got to be willing to be made whole and to be perfected. And you might say, okay, but nobody's perfect. Right. But there's a difference between perfection and being perfected. Because perfection is the end result. And you're right. Nobody is perfect. But being perfected, that's a process. James mentions this 5 times in his book. It means that we should be working towards becoming whole and intact, not fractured and divided. James's entire focus is to be whole in one's faith and devotion to God, and that our words, actions, and faith are all focused on love of God and love of neighbor. In verse 8, he writes, "Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you." Now, this is not a conditional if-then clause. It's not God won't draw near to you unless you draw near to God. It means draw near to God who is already drawing near to you. Now here's where I get to throw in some Chico Area Interfaith Council stuff that goes along with the grant that we've got. And we can put a checklist on it and say, Jesse said that. That's terrible. That's not true. The idea of healing the fractured self, centering ourselves, faithfulness, mindfulness, and humility is not just a long-standing tradition in the Christian faith. The process of perfecting and working towards unity is universal in every faith tradition. James just happens to be the best spokesperson for this idea in our tradition. But because humility is so difficult for so many Western Christians to grasp, we sometimes avoid talking about it. Remember, when we started our study on James a couple of weeks ago, we acknowledged that James isn't everyone's favorite book. And maybe it's because the wisdom that James teaches, the wisdom that he tries to teach, that we should become doers of the word and not just hearers of the word. Because after all, as James says in chapter 2, faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead.